Okay, hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Review podcast. Today I have two guests. I will allow them to introduce themselves. So, Randy, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm Randy Carney. I'm an associate professor of biomedical engineering at UC Davis, University of California, Davis. It's a great school that's mostly known for the vet school and ag stuff. I came here many years ago. My partner came to the vet school here, and I managed to do the strange get hired as a faculty where you did your postdoc, which I was told was not possible, but I guess it is. And it's been great. I run a lab here where we're mostly focused on EV heterogeneity and using lots of cool optical techniques to assess that. Half the lab is thinking about pulling EVs out of blood to do diagnostics with them. And half the lab is using EVs as engineered drug delivery. But we're pretty upstream from all those truly translational applications, and a lot of it just focuses on kind of stringent EV characterization or and engineering, or tends to.
And I'm Colin Hisey. I'm a brand new assistant professor at Northwestern University. So my lab is up in our Evanston campus, so almost an hour north of Chicago, but we can see downtown from the lake. Um, yeah, so I did postdocs in New Zealand at the Hub for EV Investigations and kind of learned the field very broadly there, and then did another postdoc at Ohio State and came here about a month ago. My lab focuses primarily on micro and nano fabrication, a bit of biosensing, and we take a very broad view of the EV field and kind of pick and choose projects that we think sound interesting. But my background is largely in micro device design and fabrication, and lately we're interested in continuing some of our surface enhanced Raman spectroscopy work, similar to what Randy does, hopefully in a collaborative setting with Randy and other people in that field. And we have some recent technology on micropatterning EVs, so mimicking matrix-bound EVs and building multifunctional devices to mimic those types of EVs and understand their function and potential use as therapeutics.
So, we have, I think, a broad scope for what we can talk about today, but as I said before we started recording, we can definitely talk about the upcoming ISEVxTech conference that is it November that it's coming to Baltimore?
Yep.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
right.
Late November.
All right.
Yep.
Take it
It's
away. What
20.
would you like to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's November 21st through the 23rd, and late breaking abstract submission is still open. And so if you're not registered and want to join, there's still plenty of time to register and join us. But yeah, it's a different kind of meeting. I can just briefly describe kind of the format. I think this was a format that was conceived by Ken Whitwer a couple years ago. And then COVID messed everything up, and I think we had to delay it till 2022 for the first iteration. And that's because it really is meant to be an in-person meeting. And the premise is that instead of having a day full of talks, we have some talks, but then we have the live session, the main activity that happens in the afternoon of the conference is actually working with the instruments in the vendor hall. And so they bring samples, you can bring samples, and you actually kind of do a round robin circuit around the room, and you move from booth to booth and actually test or see them test the instruments. You get hands-on experience. And this was originally conceived because I think we have a big problem in the EV field that there's, and maybe in science in general, that there's not usually a lot of crosstalk between the people developing the tools. And on the other side, there's a lot of complaining from academics about the tools not being appropriate for what we need. And if you're like me, the idea of engaging with the vendors at a typical conference is socially awkward, and usually I tend to try to avoid them as much as possible. I like to evaluate technologies on my own and not have some person over my shoulder telling me how great it is. And so I thought this was a really awesome idea where you could actually see it working, ask technical questions, talk about technical needs that you have, and be more collaborative with the industry. Ken's vision was that the industry would love this, and they did. So we did the first iteration of this in Hawaii in 2022 as sort of a second meeting compared to the big ISEV meeting every year. We had a few hundred people come out. It was a small single session meeting, and we did this round robin, and it was super fun. And the people that joined the conference loved it, and so we immediately knew that we wanted to do it again at some point. And so this is going to be the second iteration this fall.
So, Colin, were you at the first ISEVxTech in Hawaii?
I was, yeah. The initial draw was because it was in Hawaii, of course, but no, it was fantastic, and I think I have to echo what Randy said. I think the EV space needs a conference like this. We're constantly running up into technology issues, and sometimes the vendors, I feel like, or at least up until the first ISEVtech, were often developing things with beads, for instance, and then expecting it to translate directly into the EV space. And for EV researchers, that just was very frustrating. We're constantly, I feel like, having to adapt some of these technologies to our application instead of just working with the manufacturers and suppliers to design it differently. And so to me, it was refreshing. I think the parent ISEV conference is fantastic, but often the vast majority of talks are kind of biological hypothesis driven. And ISEVtech was very largely focused on technology development, optimization, establishing what ground truth is, like what is an actual EV, comparing different technologies. And so all that kind of happened within the 2.5 day whirlwind. And it was kind of fun just to see, how do you organize something like that? How do you move people around between the different vendors and get them using machines? Like, the logistics of it is actually kind of tricky when you have something set up like that. But I really liked it, so that's why I agreed to be on the organizing committee this year. Also, I think there's like a pretty established group of EV technology folks that their entire research program is built around technology, and so having an excuse to get everyone together and kind of discuss where they're at and have people present not only what we know that they're working on, but kind of the latest and greatest of EV tech, and then that combined with intermingling with the vendors, I think is just a nice combination.
So, what are you like? How is this one going to be different to the one in Hawaii? Like, what are you introducing anything new, changes in format or expansion? Like, is it going to be a bigger conference than the first one?
Yeah, slightly, and I think we wanted to maintain the format because we thought it worked pretty well, and wanted to pilot that a second time. So we're going to have plenary talks and talks in the morning, and then the afternoons will be this round robin. We expanded it a little bit from the education side, just thinking about formalizing the educational content a bit more. So trainees that attend will be able to get a certificate, kind of like an EV 101 training. And it's similar to the passport that we did at the main ISEV meeting, where if you stop around all the booths and get this requisite information, then you're eligible for this certificate. So you actually have something that says like, I was trained on these. I know about these, and so that's kind of fun. And we hope to would even encourage even more engagement with trainees and the companies. And then I think the biggest thing that's new is that in the past 2 years, there's been a ton of new technologies. There's new companies that we're engaging that will be there showing off their wares. There's previous companies that have new versions of their products. And some of them even inspired by conversations from 2 years ago, and talking to folks and making connections and then improving their technologies and bringing them back. And I think one thing that's been fun for us is then diving in published literature, finding, even in the past weeks, and finding like, oh, wow, this is a really amazing new technology that I've never seen. Let's try to reach out to these people and get them to come talk about it here. And yeah, I think it's just when I go to the main ISEV meeting, I'm always trying to go to the tech talks. That's what I'm interested in. It happens to be usually it's like they're all scheduled at the exact same time, and you have to pick one or the other, and you never get to see everything that you want to see. And so, yeah, it is nice having a meeting where everything is in the weeds of the nerdy part of characterizing and even new technologies, not just related to characterization or instrumentation, but to drug delivery and engineering. And so, yeah, for me personally, it's all the fun parts of the EV field into one meeting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, is there anything And like this is more of an opinion-based question, I guess, but do you think there's any area that's really like lagging behind on the tech side of things that needs a lot of work or maybe is on the way? Like there's new stuff coming out that could change things drastically?
Uh, I kind of want Randy to go first on this one. But what I will say is I don't want to give away all my ideas. So there's certain tech things that I think we have a solution for that can be really useful. But I think a lot of the single EV imaging technology has kind of gone from being in its infancy to being really user friendly. So I'm excited to see what a lot of those companies that are doing kind of like the single EV ELISA workflows, like where they're at. Um, I think the isolation can always use more and more optimization, but I'm more excited to see kind of the novel isolation methods. We have our standard toolbox of ultracentrifugation, size exclusion chromatography, filtration. Those are pretty well established, but I think people are finding more and more clever ways to isolate things in a less tedious manner. So that should be fun. I think there's at least one or two companies that have completely brand new products that I've never seen before. So that should be fun. Randy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think about this question a lot, or as an EV characterization person, or get asked quite a bit of, what's the gap? And I usually give the same answer, which is single molecule sensitivity on single EV resolution, which is a technology that just really doesn't exist. Maybe for a few markers we can get that, right? And certainly there's been as Colin alluded to, there's a slew of instruments now that can do single EV analysis, but they're rarely ones that also have single molecule sensitivity. So bridging that gap, I think, is really interesting. And we actually have a talk lined up of someone that's developing a technology just like that at ISEVxTech. I also think integrated technologies is something that lags behind. So, dual isolation and characterization devices that can do sort of all in one. And, you always see kind of, maybe flash in the pan is too demeaning, but you see big papers that show this amazing microfluidic chip that does this thing, and they characterize it in 20 patients, and then you never hear about it again. And so I think translating those lab sort of on a chip technologies to then true commercial application, I think is another thing that interfacing with industry from the academic side can sort of help advance those technologies. And then in the in vivo distribution aspect, I think people typically aren't thinking of this as a tech, right? It's not a black box that you put on your desk, but certainly technology that improve biodistribution, retention, and tissue specific tropism, and all these things. It seems to me that the largest success in the literature is coming from engineering approaches to do that. Again, making these a kit that one could buy and use and exploit, I feel that we're pretty far away from. So it all, to me, it all boils down to that translation of having some proof of concept lab into a technology ready for deployment. That's the gap.
Yeah, and I guess like it's this fine balance between like you want it to be accessible so people can use it, but then does that take away from the expertise of the labs that have put so much time and energy into developing a technology that, perhaps was coined by them or only used by a select few groups to advance the field, but then all of a sudden you've got technology that is good that can be used in any lab by any old person and kind of takes that novel aspect away. Perhaps that's just science at the end of the day. Like you're always aiming to make something that will be useful to the masses, essentially. But like, do you think that could be problematic in the future, or is that a good thing?
I think generally that's a great thing. Um, Within our lab, there's a lot of things you could do within micro and nanotech to interrogate or measure an EV in some way, but ultimately, I'm just starting to kind of think of our tech in terms of products, because ultimately, if you want these things to get translated clinically or even to an international scale research setting, they have to be user friendly. or they have to be so good that it's worth having someone trained as like a super user to operate it. And generally, those things just don't get adopted widely. So we're mostly interested in building technologies that can get turned into a kit eventually. Um, Sometimes the timeline of that could be from a few years to like a decade. We're comfortable with anything like that. Um, but generally, we're thinking eventually someone else is going to have to use this, so let's build it from the beginning as best as we can. And usually, simple solutions are the things that get adopted. What do you think, Randy?
Agreed. A lot of stuff is over engineered, and you think about the complexity of translating it. It's like you can be really cynical that there's a lot of hurdles. And frankly, in academic labs, we're not. It's a whole nother skill set to get a technology ready for deployment. I mean, I don't know if you guys have heard of these like TRLs, the technology readiness levels. This is like a NASA thing, and I think the EU has adopted it. I think originally it was for space exploration technologies, but it's basically these steps 1 through 9 that assess the maturity level of a technology to be ready for deployment. And it starts at TRL1, which is the basic principle is observed. And then it goes all the way through, proof of concept, and then validating it in a lab, and validating it in relevant environments, then demonstrating it works in those environments, and then prototyping, and then qualifying the system, and then doing that in a real operational environment. And at academic labs, we're like level 0 and 1 always. And it's a whole nother skill set to advance through those levels. I would argue multiple skill sets. And it's not really the focus, I think, of funding, right? I mean, still one of the main funding criteria at NIH is innovation. And so as you said, taking something that has already been shown and then just making it translational or usable is not it's not usually seen as innovative, and so for that reason it's not really fundable by the major sources. So instead you have to go through industry, and then we're not trained in doing that sort of thing either. So I think a lot of it is just a knowledge gap on how we as PIs that run research labs that are working on these basic technology concepts, it's just an inexperience and an inability of our training to even know how to then take those and get those into users' hands.
Yeah.
It's,
Oh, sorry. Go,
I was just
Colin.
going to say so much of that process comes down to institutional support too. Like Randy said, we're not trained to commercialize technologies, even if it's incredibly useful. And if you're not in the right setting, and you don't have a really supportive technology commercialization office, it's difficult to even get the exposure to potential companies that would license it or help you develop it further. If you're not in the right location, even if it's great, it may never make it to the end users.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've definitely heard of the TRL levels before, Andy. So hopefully maybe it's making its way throughout academia to make people aware of these things. But I guess like I had this conversation with someone recently where there's so many startup companies now. Like it's just going at this exponential rate, and maybe they won't all make it, but certainly for scientists when I we don't exactly get paid what like a medical doctor would get paid for the same amount of training, right? So we're always at the mercy of funding, grants, whatever, and the salary is humble for the amount of education that we have. So like I was thinking like is it going to be the way where people are just going to start working towards like I need to make that one thing from my research that's going to be able to be translated and make us get a startup going and actually like have a side hustle, and it might be one product, it might be multiple, and this maybe it's because the setting I'm at now it's more like translational research focused. It seems to be like not that uncommon for people to do that in conjunction with their institution. Because obviously you, as a scientist, you're in an institution, you need support from wherever you are to do your research. And yeah, as you say, if you have that supportive environment, then perhaps you'll go on that track to actually making something that could become a product or be translated into like an assay or instrument or something. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think we're all going to be like part scientist, part business person in the future.
I think it'd be great. I mean, I think we should be getting trained in translating. I mean, Colin and I both come from biomedical engineering, where it's also very common for a PI to have startups, and sometimes multiple startups, and certainly the expectation is that we are translating our technologies. Of course, that's not true. It depends on the lab and where you're at as far as your research projects. But I don't know. I think having a less than optimal salary if you're doing the comparative analysis to MDs is there's good aspects to that as well, because people tend to do this job because they have to do the job personally, not because they're making money off of it, right? And I think that attitude is reflected in the work, and so it's not easy to do this stuff. And if you're just doing it to get a salary, I think you get diminishing returns. And yeah, there's lots of startups, and I think we hear about a lot of them. There's actually not a lot of products, so there's a big gap, right? Having spun off a startup from my own lab's research and IP in the past couple of years, and have gone through tech transfer, patent regulatory conversations, trying to raise money in Bay Area, biotech to establish a foothold in a particular technology in a given indication. It is anything but welcoming and straightforward and easy. So people can start startups all day. That's fine. Getting over that hump and having to, basically hustle to convince hundreds of people that this is a good idea and that you're the unique person that can do it, or your team is the unique team that can do it, is not easy. It's really not easy. And some people break through, and then, they make a lot of money and they develop a product that's useful, and that's great. But of course, that's not the norm, and it's because it's a real test. People, outside of some probably very famous cases, people aren't funding, stuff that doesn't work. So you have to have lots of proof of concept, and then there's a really important stage called due diligence, which is when they commit to give you money. But before they give you money, let's say investors, they kick the tires of your thing. You put them under NDA, and they look at all of your data, and they look at what not just your pitch, but what you actually have, and then decide if they're going to fund you or not. And so these are really stringent steps that I think ensure that technologies, in large part, are actually working and useful and will make a return on that money for the investors. And all these steps are just really difficult to overcome. And so I really don't get discouraged when I see an EV startup in a similar space to me, because I think, oh boy, it's really hard to do anything. And I think product spaces tend to be so specific that there's plenty of room for us all to be translating technologies, I think.
Yeah, I think you need to have a lot of shots on goal to have something be successful. I think that's not just in the EV space or the technology space, but just businesses generally. I know Randy and I are both kind of investing nerds, but if you look historically just at stocks generally, the ones that are responsible for the equity risk premium. So if you want to outperform treasuries, it's between like 1% and 4% of companies are responsible for the historical returns. And that's just because most things ultimately can't generate enough profit and value to stick around. And that's at every stage of a company. But I do think the number that you see, I think there's a big incentive just from how much biotech has exploded in the last years with all the COVID vaccines and other technology. If you're in the Boston area, it's just people are hopping from one biotech startup to another. They know their stage of company that they belong in, and they'll get through like the initial stage and move on to another one, or wait till they vest and move on to another one. So I think it's just the nature of it, and I think there's nothing wrong with having a lot of failures. I think it's just part of it, and as a founder, as someone working in one of those, you take on that risk, and hopefully you're rewarded for it. As far as the incentive for academics or people at the ground level of tech development to get into commercialization, I'm starting to think about that more since I just started this position. And I think if you like long term in an academic career, the goalpost is pretty clear for me in getting tenure. It's like get some grants, get some papers out. But then after that point, there are a few trajectories you can go if you want to be more and more well compensated. It's either like an administrative route or ultimately you kind of need to start a company. So once that big milestone is checked, I see a lot of people, especially here, but everywhere. That's when they really kick the commercialization in gear because there is a huge financial incentive and not that much risk if you have a stable job to fall back on. So I plan on once basically I see that promotion is pretty secured, like going full steam ahead into commercialization. I'll probably dabble on it up until that point, but there's a huge incentive, especially since you can de-risk it. So um, I think the timeline kind of worked with you too, Randy, where you were kind of 4 or 5 years into your lab and
Yeah,
started
you're able
focusing
to
on it.
take on bigger risks. And that's a really good point. I mean, I did it because I have a stable job. It makes sense as part of my research plan. And I'm not a true entrepreneur where I have to make it work or it's onto a whole new, career field or a new product. And then it made sense. I mean, there's so much noise when you start thinking about translating stuff. In my case, it's talking to clinicians that would adopt a diagnostic test and investors that you try to convince that there's a market, who's going to pay for this, the insurance of it all, and then never mind the regulatory and translation. And you just take meetings and you talk to people that have been through it before with similar products, or people that are, have a lot of street cred and make connections with these. And I have a fantastic CEO of my company who does this full time. And she's just amazing at getting in the room with people. And in a lot of these meetings, they're very curt and rude and say like, this won't work, or this just simply is dumb, or is just a bad idea, or yeah,
So
but someone
these
tried
just
this. And
investors that you're talking about,
yeah,
like
or
no,
even
not
clinicians of like, this will
yeah,
never be
okay.
used in this cancer. And then you have to crowdsource that information because everyone has their own coloring of their background and experience, which leads them to think it's a good or bad idea. And so there was a lot of times at the beginning where I was pretty discouraged of like, wow, well, this guy's a huge oncologist in this field, and he's saying they would never use something like this, so I guess that's it. And then you take another meeting and the person's like, this is exactly what we need. I would love to have this tool. And you start to realize like, oh, there is a lot of noise, and it's on you to demonstrate the need and the clinical value within reason to maybe people that would initially be not that interested. And it's not all cynical. I think it's not that investors only want a return on investment. We've had plenty of meetings with people that are really passionate about healthcare or about certain indications or diseases that their family might have been afflicted by, and there is a lot of philanthropy in these deeper pockets, or at least that's part of it. It's complicated. So I think we're very lucky that we're able to take some of our time and have a lot of institutional support to be able to help us drive toward those directions. And where I'm at UC Davis, I mean, it's a major aspect of what I'm exposed to from tech transfer. I mean, there's seminars all the time. They're bringing people to talk about translating technologies. They're making connections. They have events in the Bay Area where they're really trying to enable us to be successful in that realm, because it is really complicated, and the complexity of it all can really take so much time. And we have full-time jobs already of mentoring students and writing academic papers and securing grant funding and teaching. So it's not like your only job, or then so it's a whole nother job that you have to do on top of that. And so having support, I don't know how people would do it from scratch, but without those opportunities or resources.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's it takes a huge commitment from an institution. If you think about the staff to run one of those offices, all the patent lawyers, um, yeah, I think it takes one big payoff for them to be completely committed. So I think some institutions, one drug gets through, they make billions, and then they're all of a sudden their technology commercialization office is expanded like
Yeah.
tenfold, or leadership comes in and they're I think at Ohio State, someone came in and they were just like, frankly, we're just not patenting enough. Like the numbers don't make sense. Clearly, we're publishing a lot. We're not patenting enough. And so one, president or dean comes in and it can change the entire culture. So
Yeah,
it's
the
so
whole
much of it is,
calculus of it all is very complicated. And
yeah,
I mean, in my case, I have IP from my lab that we get a fast license for my company to use. But that's not necessarily the case. I think most people are patenting or getting some IP on technologies that come out of their lab, and then they expect another company to take that and license it and run with that, and then they're not really involved in that aspect. So even doing it yourself is a whole different kind of game and a whole different conversation. And some of the, I'm a couple years ahead of Colin in this career field, and so I'm luckily able to pay forward some of the advice that I got. And I think one thing I tried to convey to him was going earlier into commercialization, at least for me, was extremely helpful in improving the other parts of my academic life. So now in my brainstorming, in my typical, scientific brainstorming process, I'm already thinking about commercialization and all these challenges and who and what is needed on that far end at the very conception of projects, which never used to enter into my frame of thinking. It was only about some interesting scientific premise that I hadn't seen before, a small connection, and we still explore questions like that too, which may have no commercial value but are very interesting. But for the bigger ideas, I think my NIH applications are much stronger because you're able to convey a much bigger significance and path to actually impacting patients. That just sounds more mature because it is more mature because you've started to go through that with other technologies and products. So even if you don't make that big project and translate it through, especially in your first attempts, it's just going through that pipeline. It's like getting reps. You're able to pull that into your project initiation and make everything stronger.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you'd be very lucky to hit a home run on the first try, right? It's probably going to be multiple iterations or multiple projects before you get to one that's got real potential.
But yeah, that latent benefit of designing better projects in the future might be more important. And training students, right? I think most of our students don't become PIs, the vast majority, right? They go into industry or they start their own startups. So having them exposed to that pipeline is extremely valuable for their training too. So I always try to pull in my students and trainees into these meetings, and so they're starting to hear this language and be able to communicate their ideas. And even at the local stage with my internal IP office, if I want to have them consider, protecting some of the work that's coming out of the lab, I have to convince them. So I write it up. They determine if a meeting is even worth it. Then I sit in a hot box for multiple hours with these people while they grill you on, why would anyone care, or what's the competing technologies, all these things that make your project stronger, because you're pitching it to someone who's not in the EV field or who's not in diagnostics even, but they're science minded, or they maybe they have a law degree focused on IP. And so the challenges, deep challenges from the university personnel that are incentivized to, only secure patents on the material that it's gambling, right? That they bet will be licensed, is a really good sort of level of stringency to put your products up against, and helps with science communication and being able to convey your thoughts clearly and show exactly the value and the comparative value between competing technologies. Then I'm having to read about all these competing technologies so I can evaluate mine. So I'm learning. So I just find the whole process to be extremely informative for just, again, initiating new projects.
Yeah, I think in general, the value of effectively communicating your science to someone who is not in your field is like very undervalued.
That is the job. I think that is our job. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be able to do it.
Papers or grants or whatever, right?
Yeah. And not like I'm suggesting don't go pitch your idea to like all your friends and family all the time. Like just, I'm sure that would become annoying. But definitely pitching to people outside your field on a semi-regular basis for trainees or anyone at any career level is just good practice, and you very quickly find out where the holes are in what you're communicating, because it's so easy to go to ISEV and just talk about EVs all day, and everyone kind of knows what you're talking about without having to
fill in
give
the gaps. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you try and do the same thing to someone else who's not in the field, and they're like, what do you like?
Or even when I'm pitching ideas to you guys or my colleagues in the field, I might get really good scientific feedback, right, about gaps in controls and alternative explanations, but if I'm presenting my work at ISEV, it's rare to get a question in the audience of like deep in the weeds of like, well, will the FDA ever approve something like this, or what's the path to commercialization for this? They're always at the research level, and so having a whole new audience to pitch these ideas to that are evaluating the next stages is a whole different thing that we typically don't get, right? And I think it's really valuable, and we probably should get that more. And now I'm kind of trained. I see all these huge impact papers come out that show some really compelling results, and now I'm immediately thinking like, yeah, but that's complicated. That's like a 4-piece nanoparticle. Yeah, it's really amazing, and it's new, and it works, and it's novel, and the proof of concept is definitely there. But man, how are they going to scale that up? That's crazy, right? And that's typically not in my thought process historically.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Is this like a region specific thing, perhaps in the US, like anywhere where that's a major hub for investment and startups, you'll have more of that integrated into your institution where they have these seminars and things that you can come and find out about pathways to commercialization. Whereas Colin, I mean, I don't know what it's like at Northwestern or Ohio State where you were, like, do you have similar things, or is it not so much focused on those aspects?
I think it can definitely be geography dependent, especially in the biomedical space. Clearly, California, particularly the Bay Area and Boston, are the hotbeds, but really California generally, the West Coast, much of the West Coast too. Part of it, I think, is getting things to clinical translation. A lot of universities in the middle of nowhere that have incredible science and engineering, but for instance, don't have a large hospital network on campus. That can immediately hamstring you for a while until you're able to find the right collaborators and get access to patient samples or whatever you need. And so I think sometimes those institutions that are, in like a college town in the middle of nowhere, Davis is small, but at least they have San Francisco right down the road. But if you're in the Midwest in the middle of nowhere, they may be way less invested because the infrastructure is not there. The connections to the funders, a lot of them aren't in those areas physically. So it can definitely vary geographically.
Yeah, or even in your department, you don't see those examples of the people that did it. So it's harder to imagine yourself doing it. You have to break so much ground. Whereas I think when you tend to be geographically closer to these hubs, you tend to have a lot more examples, in your own department or at your institution where you can say like, oh, well, these people are doing it. So it seems like the momentum to get over that hump to start down this road is like the energy barrier is a lot lower.
But, if something's that valuable that it just like demands those conversations, like the technology commercialization office, to keep pushing it and keep pushing it. I think sometimes those can be the drivers for a wider culture change in a university. If someone comes up with something that useful, but I'd be curious to see like those people who study the science of science to quantify this, like because a lot of places in the Midwest, there's fantastic basic science happening, fundamental science that can then lead to it. And I wonder if there's a distribution that you could quantify. I bet it's pretty significant.
Yeah, so I mean, now that we've spoken about all of that stuff, like I really want to hear about what you guys are both working on at the moment, individually, or if you got joint projects. So, and kind of like, I think Randy, you kind of alluded to how you ended up at UC Davis, by way of your partner going to school there. But what about your early, like how did you get interested in science? And Colin, the same to you. So just want to know like backstory and then how you got interested in more like the tech side of things as well.
I think Randy has a pretty crazy journey too, so we have to limit this to like a couple minutes. It's going to be talking about Switzerland
the
and
quick story.
The speed
Actually,
version.
yeah. So I'm a military brat. So my dad was in the Air Force, and we moved all around the world. And a common theme on military bases is a great public library. And I spent lots of my time as a kid in the library. And at a certain point, you just get bored and start looking at different types of books. And I remember I came across Eric Drexler's, which I didn't know at the time, but is a quite famous book on nanotechnology, that he wrote in the 80s or late 90s. It was already quite old when I probably looked at this in the mid 90s. I must have been, I don't know, 12 or 13 years old, late 90s. And it was so cool. It was nanotechnology. It was actually about gray goo, that you'll get self-replicating nanobots that will eventually swarm everything and take over the world. And for some reason, that book unlocked something in my mind that the word nano I just thought was so cool. And I think you always kind of envision, what's my career? What's my life going to be? What's my job? I already was academically minded and liked school and liked math, especially. I loved doing times tables. I remember racing, and it was like a competition, like how many. So I was already thinking in that way. And so the nano was always kind of percolating there. I'm first gen college, so when I got to college, I didn't even know professors had research labs at all. I remember in one of the orientation things, they had a grad student come up and talk about, and they're like, I do research in this professor's lab, and I was like a company on the campus somewhere. I couldn't even conceive what that was. Then in an awesome twist of fate, we had a new PI. I was majoring in chemistry at Arkansas, and they made this great, cool new PI teach freshman chemistry for the majors. And on the first day of class, and now I do this, instead of talking anything about chemistry, he talked about what his lab research is, and it was nanoparticles. And it just all connected. And I immediately was like, I have to get in this guy's lab. I love nano. I always envisioned myself working on that. Research sounds amazing. And I pestered him for like 2 years. And I remember having multiple, in retrospect, cringy meetings where I was like, I want to do research. He's like, why? And I'm like, I don't know. Nano sounds cool. He's like, okay, like you're pretty young. And so I think after I had him again a year later, and he was like, okay, you can come volunteer in my lab. And I didn't do a great job. I didn't show up as much as I should. And now I set very clear expectations with my undergrads of like what meaningful research looks like. And it was a great opportunity. And, the imposter syndrome kicked in, and I'm sitting in group meetings, and everywhere I'm like, what language are they speaking? I hope no one looks at me or calls on me. But you start to grow, and then you start to understand more in a group meeting, and you're like, okay, I'm getting this. I had a crazy opportunity to go to MIT for a summer between my junior and senior year to do an rEView. And I had a great experience there and worked in a lab and even got some results and got a paper published. And then I went back to that lab for grad school, and no doubt, because I'm sure that PI pulled my application out of the list and said, oh, this guy like worked really hard for that summer. I'm sure it'll be good. So yeah, that's how I got to research. No one in my family does research. They all they know about it is through me. And so I'm kind of like a weird black sheep in the family who does weird science research, but I think they all dig it. So it's nice and supportive. But yeah, it wasn't, I never, I just kind of fell into it based on exposure.
You didn't mention Switzerland. I want to hear about.
Well, yeah, my PI who I joined at MIT left halfway through and moved the whole lab to Switzerland. So that was, he basically came to group meeting one day and said, we're leaving in a year. Anyone that wants to come can come. And I just got into MIT, right? So I'm like, no, I'm not coming. Over the next few months, just my partner and I talked about it, and we're like, when are we ever going to get the opportunity to be paid to live in Europe? I lived in England when I was a kid. I had international experiences. I knew I wanted to do that at some point, and you kind of always imagine like, yeah, maybe later I'll work there. And it's like, no, this is an opportunity to do it right now with no risk. Like and I loved my project. I was doing nanoparticle work, and I loved my PI. Still do. Shout out Stellaci. He won't listen to this, so that's okay. It was at a certain point we're like, yeah, let's do it. Then it's a two-body problem. My partner moved with me. She mastered out of her. She wasn't really digging research as much as me, and she wanted to do vet school. She volunteered while we were in Switzerland to apply, and she got into Davis, which is the #1 school for vet med. And so I was like, all right, now we're going to Davis. And I searched around nanoparticles at Davis, and I found this amazing postdoc mentor, Kit Lamb, who I joined here. And then even at that point, I wasn't thinking research, career, academia. I always thought of my PI in grad school as like a genius and was like operating at a really high level of strategic thinking about science. And I never really felt that I had that. And he challenged me at some point to, apply my creativity that I do to other parts of my life to science. And I wasn't ever really thinking about it like that. I was always thinking of science as very like prescriptive recipes. And he was like, yeah, actually it's how I, express my creativity. And I think that really changed something in my mind about how I was thinking about project development and science. And then I in my postdoc, I realized that I really like to write grants. I was writing a lot of proposals to support myself, from ideation to writing was like, it was pure like dopamine, and still is. And everyone, all my my lab makes fun of me all the time because it's always a new grant and a new idea, which I think is pretty common for PIs. And I think you have to love to write and have new ideas if you want to be happy in this job. So yeah, just more and more started to be a natural fit. And then the most important random luck of all is that I made it through the bottleneck and got a position. I think it's people ask me, oh, do you have advice on how to do it? And the number 1 through 10 advice is be lucky. That's really it. I mean, everyone is working hard and everyone is doing a great job, and there's way more people that are qualified and want to do it than can do it. So it's really tough.
That's great to hear.
Nice story.
One thing I want to mention before I forget is I think Randy and I connected partially because we have this international sensibility. I think both of us have lived abroad multiple times, and part of loving science, part of loving science is being able to connect with people on the other side of the world, like instantly, if it's even tangentially related to your field. Okay, my story, I grew up in a small kind of rural area outside of Cleveland, Ohio, about 15 minutes southwest of Cleveland. No scientists or engineers in my family history. I didn't even know that it was really a career. It seems like a lot like Randy's background. My mother, like for most of my childhood, was a music director in a church, making next to nothing. And my dad was kind of a lower ranking firefighter at a neighboring city. So the early memories I remember, similar to Randy, is just like I was really good at math from as long as I can remember doing math, it just clicked. I think that's a common driver for most engineers, because people who do know about engineering are like, you can do math? Engineers make good money. Like, go do it. 4 years, you come out making good money. But kind of formative memories, I remember my dad bringing home basically what I think was a dumpster of computer parts, and just assembling them and reassembling them. And I was probably 11 or 12 at this point. So having, boxes of RAM and CPUs and motherboards that you could just fry and toss and then pull out the next one. And then I would get them running and I taught myself QBasic at like 12 or so. And so that kind of set me on a trajectory, along with just continuing to perform well academically, similar to Randy. And then ultimately went to University of Dayton. And I think the biggest thing that probably led to research as far as planting the seed. So I'm biracial, and I got into the minority engineering program there, which had a component that was you get placed into a lab as basically a job to do research. And so I was doing a bunch of things I had no business doing, like carbon nanomaterials and shooting femtosecond lasers at things and just watching them melt because I didn't know what I was doing. But that early exposure, I think, was like really formative. Never published anything. Probably broke a few things if I think back. And then did a master's in chemie at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which was my first like real intense research exposure in materials. Ended up getting a paper out of that, and then kind of last minute applied to OSU to study micro and nano fabrication. So I work with Derek Hansford there, mostly on microfluidic devices. So a lot of my background is like in a clean room building chips. And then right at the end of that, got interested in EVs. We made a chip to capture and release EVs. And Cherie Blancaron, who you guys know, posted something on a very obscure Facebook page on exosomes. It was like called exosomes, microvesicles, and something else. And I was looking abroad because during my PhD, I had spent a year in Spain and wanted another international experience. Applied to a few places, and that interview just went really well, and that kind of set me on the EV route. So I had that background in micro nano, and then working with Cherie and Larry Chamley at University of Auckland for 3 years gave me this very broad perspective of EVs, from like milk to embryo culture media to bioreactors, and took that back to Ohio State and kind of planned on staying there, but ultimately made it through the bottleneck as well with a huge help from a grant that I got related to EVs, and very fortunately ended up at Northwestern, which is just an unbelievable research infrastructure, the best core facilities maybe in the country. Like, they're just well maintained, training instantly accessible, and just a great culture of research. Like lots of different, especially in our department. We're not huge, so we can't focus on everything, but bioelectronics, synthetic biology, we have like these core areas that we're are really good at. And so hopefully I can bring more EV expertise here. Um, but yeah, it's a crazy path, I think. But the common thread for most faculty, some people kind of get on the train and they end up there just by nature of the groups they're in and their early exposure. But I think Rainey and I both kind of zigzagged all over the place. And as far as project, I think the thing, I'm going to switch gears and talk about research because I don't know how much time we have, but I
Oh
think
yeah,
Rainey and I
let's.
both. Oh, okay. Well, I have seminar at we have Ed Boyden here for seminars, so I can't skip out on it. I think the thing we're working on together is kind of trying to understand the real technical limitations of translating Raman spectroscopy of EVs. We each have kind of separate projects related to micro and nanotech and sensors with EVs, but how do you actually take something that seems to work reasonably well, but requires fancy substrates or particles and really careful isolation of EVs, and then operation of a Raman microscope, and then the processing on the back end. Something that we know is useful, but there are steps and steps of technical challenges ultimately to translate it into a diagnostic or screening platform. And so I think Rainey and I are both kind of interested on the software side and the hardware side and the EV side. And we have several ideas, kind of like cross multiple site comparisons, trying to one of the common criticisms of our field is reproducibility. So showing that we can measure the same thing on two different microscopes at two different sites and try to show some kind of comparability. We're really interested in like how do you process the data, which can be really noisy. And then of course, how do you like build a classifier on the back end? And I think we're trying to collaborate on some of those things, but obviously I've been in a transition phase. But I want to hear Randy's perspective too, because I've been kind of all over the place for the last 6 months or so.
No, it's good, and I mean, yeah, I think I think we work together because we like each other, and that bit about you blowing up stuff, it's like if you know Colin or know about his work, I mean, that just really, that's one of the things I probably admired about you the most is just whatever, get into a new instrument and let's just mess around. We may or may not have illegally used an instrument here at Davis while he was visiting, just in exactly the same spirit of just like, well,
Oh yeah.
what's the worst that can happen?
Yep.
And actually, I think that's how we initially got connected. I know Cherie knew me and knew you and was like, hey, here's two weird guys that like to point lasers at stuff. We should get them talking. And then you find things to collaborate on. And yeah, Colin and I are very lucky to be in across two fields, which are known for their irreproducibility, both EVs and these plasmonic substrates. But there's just so much value there. And it's kind of that bit we talked about earlier about, you can show proof of concept things quite easily. But going that next route, like just basic questions. If I see this on my scope in my lab, can I ship that to Colin or vice versa? And he sees it on his scope in his lab. It's shocking that, that's not necessarily fundable and not
Yeah.
commonly done. But it seems like a really impactful way to, and again, it's all out of our interest to actually make it work, and not just, I mean, we have plenty of projects where we're just trying to show cool stuff and do that initial proof of concept, and that's somehow more straightforward in a way that's more typical. But yeah, we've been around the block on that with Raman of EVs, and we each know that it's one of those things, like I'm sure you've all had experience in your training coming up where you try things that your lab does and you're kind of like, this kind of works, like it's oversold compared to how it's not that easy or it doesn't work that well. And when you do Raman of EVs, I mean, it works. It's very reproducible. It's very exciting. And yet we're very far from implementing that into affecting real patients. And I think it's all those things Colin said of the details of interoperator variability and the need for expert users and the complexity of the technology, and we think those are problems that you can solve in a collaborative way that's pretty easy. And we're always very careful with we have a job and we have to make high impact studies and get high impact grants, and so we're always checking with each other about intellectual contributions, and I think it's sometimes you just find people that work with that it's just easy to collaborate, and there's really no ego, or it's just fun to think of wild ideas and try to get them to work.
Yeah, that's the beauty of science. You do get to meet so many people from so many different places, and yeah, when it works, it works. And why not capitalize on that and do some cool stuff together? I think, yeah. always fun if you have a new toy to play with. Hopefully, don't break. But I think at this point, we need to say hi to Cherie. I don't think she'll listen to this either, but in case she is, hello, Cherie. And Larry Chamley, he also reviewed my PhD thesis. So, it is a small world that we live in, the EV world. Look, I'm kind of sad that I think we need to wrap it up because it's been super great talking to you both and hearing about everything, ISEVxTech, what you're doing, thoughts, opinions. I love it. So, yeah, just want to say thank you very much. Thanks for your time. We'll say goodbye to our listeners and wrap it up. See you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Nat. Thanks for the invite.